Welcome, I'm Dr. Tom Warren and you're watching The Plant Doctor. What I want to show you today is a very simple, easy way to propagate almost any plant by taking a cutting. So what we have here is forsythia. I've done a propagation video on forsythia before, but this method will work for camellias, it'll work for roses, it'll work for hollies, it'll work for azaleas, it'll work for about anything. So what you want to do first is have a nice sharp pair of hand snips. Make sure they're clean. I cleaned these with alcohol before I came out here. And all we're going to do is take terminal ends. So the ideal time to do this is going to be June and July if you're in the northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's going to be opposite. You're looking at December, January time frame for our friends in Australia. So why that time frame? We're looking for what we call semi-hardwood cuttings. So when that new growth first comes out in the spring, it's very tender. You cut it off, it wilts very fast. In the fall, it's going to be hardened off, and the harder the wood gets, the more difficult it's going to be to root it. So if you can hit the sweet spot in what we call semi-hardwood, it's not really soft, but at the same time, it's starting to harden off a little bit. That's the ideal time to do this. I'm actually doing this just a little bit early so I can publish this and edit it in time for the time for taking cuttings. So all you want to do, about 6 inches down, maybe 3 or 4 nodes, just cut the terminal ends. There's 1, there's 2, and I'm going to come back and prune these forsythia a little bit better, but I wanted to get my cuttings first. There's 3. I can go back here to this one. There's 4. There's another. I mean, you can get a dozen cuttings in just a couple of seconds. And then what we're going to do with these is we're going to strip most of the leaves off. We're just going to pull them right off. So I'm left with something that looks like that. So let's go over to the table. I'm going to show you what we're going to put them in, the media that we're going to use, and where we go from there, and how we get that to grow roots. So now that we have our cuttings, we're going to stick them in a Rubbermaid. This Rubbermaid is about 6 to 8 inches tall, and I filled it roughly halfway with sand. So there's 3 or 4 inches of sand, and you want coarse sand. You don't want really fine textured sand. You want something that has some pebbles in it, that has a fair amount of grit to it, because we want the sand to be very porous and allow water to flow to the bottom of this. We're going to add water to this here in a minute, but what we want to do is expose our cuttings to rooting hormone, and there's several different types of rooting hormone. There's powdered hormones like hormone 3. This is one of the most popular with nurserymen in terms of the powders. Garden Safe Take Root is another one. And I'll try to leave a link down in the description below for all this stuff, for the rooting hormone, for the Rubbermaid, the whole 9 yards. So you can just, if you want to do this, you just click on it and buy it and they'll send it to you. So you have your powdered hormones, or if you're doing a bunch of them, there's a product called Dip and Grow. And so Dip and Grow is a liquid rooting hormone. And so you add the mix in here and then you add water to it. And like here's 5 times diluted, 10 times diluted, 15, 20 times diluted. It'll tell you for whatever species of plant that you're trying to propagate what dilution to use. But if you're just doing a handful or you're occasionally doing this, I would recommend going with a powder. And so we already have this one stripped, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this down a little bit further. I'm going to cut just below a node. A node is where the leaves come out, a site of vegetative development. That's where a lot of adventitious tissue is going to be. So there's more cells that can turn into roots here than any other place on this stem. Here again, we've sterilized our hand snips with alcohol, so these are clean. I'm just going to slightly wound my forsythia cutting. Now from here, what I'll do is I'm going to put a little bit of rooting hormone on the cap. I do not like sticking my cuttings into the bottle itself, because if there's pathogens on my cuttings that I'm doing right now, I'm putting the pathogens in the bottle, and then when I go out again to propagate, I'm just spreading pathogens around my cuttings, lowering my success rate. I like to use the lid. We're going to put a little bit of rooting hormone on there, and don't just stick the cutting directly into the sand. You're going to knock off the rooting hormone. Take a pencil, make a little hole for it, place it in the hole, and pack it in. It's as easy as that. So I'm going to do 2 or 3 of them here real quick just to show you how fast it can go. Here again, I'm not going to slow down to talk this time. We're just going to take this. I'm going to cut right below a node. I'm going to wound it. Put some rooting powder on it, tap it off. There's our cutting. Put it down in the hole we just made with the pencil. That's how quick it goes. There's our second one. Now, what do we do with it from here? We're going to water this in, the whole thing. I want to evenly water this very lightly. I don't want a ton of water. I just want enough in here to where when I look at the bottom, if I were to hold this up, I can see moisture down there. Okay, we don't want to saturate the cuttings. We don't want them sitting in water, because really all we're trying to do is create a humidity dome here. And one other thing I need to point out to you guys is you really don't want your leaves touching the top of your container. Okay, so I've got these just a little tall. I can actually recut these. It's not a big deal. Just gonna pull off another set of leaves. We're just gonna redo the cutting. I made that one just a smidge too tall. And that's better. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm not going to do all my cuttings on camera. I just want to do 2 examples. So once you're done with your rooting powder, you can dump off the excess on the ground. It's not going to hurt anything at all. Take your alcohol, wipe it down, put the lid back on, and you keep your rooting powder clean. There's no pathogens in it. So what are we going to do with this once we put the lid on it? So I want you to notice a few things about this. This is a clear Rubbermaid. Make sure the lid is transparent as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be clear. This one's blue. I know they make ones with red. Just make sure it's transparent. Some light can get through it. Don't put this in direct sunlight. With it being clear, it's going to heat up really hot in there in direct sun. You're going to burn your cuttings up, and they're not going to take. If you're doing this in the northern hemisphere in June, July, it's warm enough outside. You can stick this under a shrub. You can stick it under a shade tree where it gets 0 direct sun at all, and just leave it there for like 8 weeks. Maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, come out, open up the lid for an hour or 2, because remember, plants, these leaves are producing oxygen. They need CO2, so we're letting the oxygen out. We're letting some CO2 get in. We're going to close it back up, and we're going to leave it that way. In about 8 weeks, you should start to see some roots on your cuttings. Now, that can be species dependent. Some plants root faster than others. So, for example, something like coleus will root in 3 or 4 days, where it may take an azalea or rhododendron maybe 3 or 4 months. Species dependent, but on average, we're going to say 8 weeks. As long as your leaves are green and healthy, they have a chance to root. So just be patient with them. You can also do this inside. So if you've got a window that gets indirect sunlight, or east or a west facing window where it's getting morning sun or afternoon sun, I probably wouldn't stick it in a south facing window. Just going to get a little too much sunlight, a little too much heat probably to do this. But that's it. You can root just about any plant inside of a Rubbermaid with a lid, some sand, and some rooting powder. Keep it humid in here. That's the main thing. We're looking for humidity, and I promise you, you'll have success. Not 100% take rate, but if you do a dozen in a Rubbermaid container, you're going to have some of them take if you follow these directions. Guys, as always, thank you for watching The Plant Doctor, and until next time, happy gardening.